Hey grade 10s, so today we're going to look at how ionic compounds form. So last time we talked about how ions form, and now we're going to look at the... So remember that an ion is an atom that has gained or lost some electrons, so now it has a charge. So for example, lithium would have lost an electron, and so it has a +1 charge. Fluorine can gain an electron to have a -1 charge. So an ionic compound is a compound that forms between two ions. So it's usually a positive ion and a negative ion, so a metal and a nonmetal. So for example, here we have lithium and fluorine, and they have formed an ionic compound. Okay, so ionic compounds always form so that the sum, or when we add the ionic charges together, it always equals 0. So that means that the number of positive charges always equals the number of negative charges. So these compounds, these ions, are going to come together in such a way so that overall the charge is 0. It's a neutral compound. Okay, so now I'm going to take you through the rules for writing these chemical formulas for ionic compounds. And I'm going to go through an example to teach you the rules. So we're going to look at the ions for calcium and iodine, and we're going to see how they come together as a formula and how we write that formula. So the first thing we're going to do is look up the element symbols on the periodic table. We always put the metal first and the nonmetal second. So here we have calcium is Ca and iodine is I. Then we're going to look up the charges for each of those elements, and we're going to write it on top of each symbol. We can find these charges on the periodic table. So if I look up calcium, it has a charge of +2 for its ion. And if I look up iodine, it will have an ionic charge of -1. And then what I'm going to do is crisscross those charges. So those charges are going to become my subscripts. So I'm going to drop the charges and write those as my subscripts. So the +2 from calcium dropped down to a subscript of 2 for iodine, and the -1 for iodine drop down to a 1 subscript for calcium. One thing to remember is that we always have to put those numbers in lowest terms, and we never write the number 1 as a subscript. So my formula for calcium and iodine as they come together as an ionic compound is CaI2. Here is just another example of how an ionic compound can be written. So here we have potassium, and it's going to react with bromine, and it's going to form the ionic compound potassium bromide. So if I was going to look this up on my periodic table, potassium has the element symbol K, and it has a charge of +1. Bromine has the element symbol Br, and it has the ionic charge of -1. So I'm going to crisscross those charges and drop them to write them as subscripts. And then what I notice is that potassium and bromine both have a charge of 1, and I never write 1 as a subscript. So my formula for potassium bromide is just KBr. And at the bottom here it's just showing the Lewis structure to show how the ions formed. So how potassium donated its electron to bromine. So potassium dropped a valence level to become the stable ion, and bromine filled up its valence shell with that extra electron. And so that's basically how these ionic compounds are forming. There's an attraction between the positive and the negative ions, and they come together as a compound. Okay, so now we're going to look at how we name ionic compounds. So sometimes we want to write out the chemical formulas, but sometimes we don't. Sometimes we just want to write their name. And so if I'm going to use the original example that we did earlier for calcium and iodine, the formula was CaI2. And to write the name, we just write the name of the metal and then we write the name of the nonmetal, calcium and iodine. And then to show that it is an ionic compound, we change the ending of the nonmetal, so our second element, we change it to ide, I-D-E. So in this example, it would be calcium, stays the same, and iodide. And that basically tells us that that is an ionic compound. Okay, so thanks for listening, and I will see you next time in class. Bye-bye.